The boy had always believed that silence carried hidden messages, the kind that lived between sounds. Maybe that is why he loved standing outside the old community center, where a single piano waited in the lobby like a gentle giant. The place wasn't fancy. Its walls carried the marks of years and weather, and the floor squeaked at every step. But to him, it felt like a secret world where something magical happened whenever someone pressed the keys. He never walked inside fully. He stayed by the open doorway or stood beside the big window watching from outside. Each time someone played even a short tune, he would pause everything he was doing. If he was carrying groceries, he stopped. If he was on his way to school, he slowed down until the melody faded. People who knew him sometimes wondered why he acted like that. But they didn't know what he felt. They didn't feel the warmth that ran through him when the music reached his ears. They didn't understand how the sound filled him with a longing he could barely describe. At home, music wasn't something he grew up with. His family lived in a small apartment where every day felt like the same routine: school, chores, dinner, sleep. There was no money for instruments or lessons. Even the idea of asking for something like that felt impossible. Still, the piano, this big, beautiful thing he had never touched, kept pulling him back to the community center every day. Most afternoons, he would lean against the window and watch the people who came to play. Some were kids learning simple tunes. Others were adults who played only for fun. Once in a while, someone talented sat down and played something that made his heart ache in the best way. On those days, he went home carrying the sound in his head, replaying it until he fell asleep. Sometimes people inside the center noticed him. A few smiled politely. Some ignored him. A couple of them whispered about how often he lingered. None of that stopped him from coming back. He wasn't bothering anyone. He just wanted to listen. Listening felt like the only thing he was allowed to do. Over time, he started to notice small details. He observed how different fingers moved across the keys. Some hands were light and gentle, while others looked strong and confident. He watched how people sat, how they breathed, how they seemed to get lost in what they were playing. He didn't realize it, but he was learning quietly from a distance just by watching. Even though he was shy, he wasn't afraid of dreams. His biggest dream was simple: to touch that piano once. Just once. He wanted to feel what the keys felt like. Were they cold? Were they smooth? Did they make a sound right away? Could he make music too? He didn't expect anyone to give him a chance. The community center was busy, and the piano was important to many people. Still, he hoped. Some days he came early and waited by the door, telling himself that today would be the day he asked. Then his courage faded, and he would walk home without saying a word. But one day something changed. He arrived later than usual and found the lobby almost empty. The piano stood by itself, silent and still. The sunlight from the window made the keys shine in a way he hadn't seen before. Something inside him pushed him forward. He took a deep breath and stepped closer, just one step at a time. His heart was pounding. His palms felt warm, felt like the world had gone quiet. Before he could get any closer, a staff member walked out from a side room. She looked surprised to see him inside. He froze and took a step back, embarrassed for even trying. She didn't say anything harsh, but the message was clear. He wasn't supposed to touch the instrument. He nodded quickly, whispered a soft apology, and hurried outside. His chest felt tight as he stood near the window again. He hated feeling like he crossed a line. He didn't want anyone to think he was causing trouble. He only wanted to try. For the next few days, he avoided going inside the doorway. He returned to listening from a distance, but even that felt different now. The music still made him feel something special, but it also reminded him of how far away he was from actually playing it. One late afternoon, as he stood outside after school, he heard a young kid inside practicing the same note over and over. It wasn't even a melody, just a single key being pressed again and again. He found himself whispering the rhythm, imagining the next step, creating a tune silently in his head. He didn't realize someone was watching him. A volunteer, someone who had seen him many times before, noticed how he listened carefully. She didn't say anything to him that day, but she paid attention. She saw the way his eyes followed the movement of the pianist inside. She saw how he reacted to every sound. He spent many evenings in the same spot. People who walked past the building sometimes recognized him and wondered why he always stood by the window. They didn't tease him or bother him. He was just the boy who loved the piano. But even though they saw him, nobody really understood him. Inside his mind, music played all the time. He could hear hidden melodies in everyday life. The hum of traffic, the tapping of shoes on the sidewalk, the soft wind brushing against the windows. All of it blended together in a way that made sense only to him. One weekend morning, the community center was crowded. A small music event was happening inside, and many families brought their kids to participate. He stayed farther back than usual, keeping close to the building's outer wall to avoid the crowd. Through the open door, he heard unfamiliar melodies. Fast, bright, complicated. His chest filled with excitement, and he couldn't stop smiling. A little girl walked out holding a beginner's music book. She dropped it accidentally, and the pages flipped in the wind. He hurried forward, picked it up, and handed it to her. She smiled shyly and thanked him before running back inside. He looked down for a moment, thinking about how she could play, and he couldn't. Not because she was older or smarter, but simply because she had been given the chance. Later that evening, he sat near the window again. A soft drizzle had started, and tiny raindrops tapped against the glass, creating a soothing rhythm. He pressed his ear closer and let the sound blend with the faint piano notes coming from inside. It was moments like these that made him believe that music found him, even when he couldn't create it himself. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet presence had been noticed more than he realized. Some staff members grew used to seeing him, though they still didn't invite him to try the piano. Maybe they assumed he wouldn't know how to treat it gently. Maybe they thought he was just a curious kid. Maybe they simply never imagined he had a deeper connection to music than many of the people who actually played. But every day he returned. Every day he listened. Every day he watched the hands of others move across the keys, memorizing shapes and patterns as if studying a language he had never been taught. Inside his heart, the longing grew stronger. He didn't want to just listen anymore. He wanted to feel the music happen under his own fingers. He wanted to know what it felt like to create sound instead of only receiving it. Though he was young, he understood something important. Sometimes, life gives you a calling long before you're allowed to answer it. And even though no one had given him the chance yet, he didn't let the hope fade. Something inside him whispered that the moment he was waiting for, the moment he finally touched the piano, would come. He didn't know how or when, but he felt it the same way he felt the music. And that whisper was enough to keep him standing there day after day, waiting quietly for the world to give him one small chance. The days after his first attempt to step inside felt heavier than usual. He still walked to the community center, still stood by the window, still listened to every sound that came from the piano. But something inside him had shifted. The small spark of courage he had built up slowly over weeks had broken the moment he stepped back from the staff member's glance. Now he carried that moment with him like a tiny bruise. It didn't show on the outside, but he felt it every time he got close to the doorway. He kept thinking about how close he had been. Just a few more steps and he would have touched the piano. The thought made him feel excited and sad at the same time. Excited because he could still imagine the keys under his fingers. Sad because he wasn't sure if he would ever get that close again. But he didn't stop coming. Deep down, he knew that if he avoided the place completely, he would regret it. So he returned every afternoon, even if all he could do was watch from a distance. People often came and went through the front doors. Some of them recognized him. A few gave him small nods or warm smiles. Others simply walked past, not noticing how deeply he cared about the music. He didn't mind that. He wasn't looking for attention. He only wanted to stay close enough to hear the piano. One afternoon, something unusual happened. A group of adults came in with notebooks and folders, looking for a place to sit. A meeting of some kind. Because the lobby was crowded, one of them accidentally pushed the piano bench a little out of place. The staff hurried to fix it, and for a brief moment nobody was playing the piano at all. He sat quiet in the corner, waiting. He stood by the window longer than usual, staring at it. The silence around the piano felt loud, almost calling him. His mind replayed every moment he had seen others play. His fingers moved unconsciously, copying the shapes he remembered from countless hours of watching. He didn't realize he was doing it until a woman walking past paused and looked at his hands. She smiled for a moment, as if entertained by how focused he looked. He quickly put his hands down, feeling embarrassed, but she didn't seem bothered. She simply walked inside. That tiny moment made him breathe a little easier. At least someone had seen him as a harmless kid, not a problem. Later, the same volunteer who had noticed him earlier was stacking chairs inside the lobby. She glanced toward the window, saw him again, and paused. She had seen many kids come and go from the center, but he was different. He didn't run around or shout or try to sneak inside. He just listened every single day. That evening, when he finally walked home, he thought again about asking permission. He kept imagining how the conversation might go. Maybe they would say yes if he asked nicely. Maybe they would let him try just one note. But then his mind replayed the look on the staff member's face from before, and his courage faded again. Days turned into weeks and the routine stayed the same. He went to school, did his chores, and then went to the community center. He stood by the window, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. If it was raining, he stood under the small awning outside. If it was cold, he wrapped his arms around himself but didn't leave. One afternoon, the piano was being played by a boy slightly younger than him. The boy kept hitting the wrong notes and sighed loudly each time. The sound wasn't pleasant, but the boy didn't give up. He tried again and again, pressing keys in a messy rhythm. From the window, he watched carefully, following the movement of the boy's hands. He whispered corrections that no one could hear. He knew how the melody was supposed to sound, even though he had never played it. When the younger boy finally gave up and left the bench, the lobby grew a little quieter. A group of kids sat nearby eating snacks and laughing. Someone rolled a basketball across the floor. A baby cried somewhere in the background. But the piano remained unplayed. His heart felt a strong pull again. He stepped a little closer to the door. Just one more step. Maybe today would be the day. A staff member noticed him and walked over. She had seen him many times before and didn't seem annoyed. She tilted her head slightly as she approached, as if she wanted to understand what brought him back each day. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "Just listening?" she added. He nodded. His voice felt stuck in his throat. She smiled in a kind way and said, "You really like music, don't you?" He nodded again, this time more confidently. She looked back at the piano for a moment, then at him. "It's a beautiful instrument. Takes a lot of practice to learn. A lot of patience." Her tone wasn't harsh, just thoughtful. He wanted so badly to tell her the truth, that he wasn't afraid of practice or patience. He just needed one chance to try. But the words didn't come out. He looked down at his shoes, afraid that if he asked again, she might say no. She didn't push the conversation further. She simply said, "Well, enjoy listening," and walked away to help someone else. He stood there a while longer, feeling torn. He wished he could speak up. He wished he could explain what he felt every time he heard the piano. The longing wasn't something simple. It wasn't something he could hide forever. That evening, the volunteer who had been watching him quietly took a seat near the piano after the staff finished their tasks. She started playing a soft, simple tune. He leaned closer to the window, listening carefully. The melody wasn't complicated, but it was peaceful. It filled the lobby with warmth. When she finished, she glanced toward the window and saw him still standing there. She smiled and waved politely. He smiled back shyly. She wondered if he had ever learned music, but something told her he hadn't. Still, she could see the spark in his eyes, the kind that didn't come from simple curiosity. As the days kept passing, his desire to touch the piano grew stronger. It wasn't a childish wish anymore. Felt like something bigger, something that belonged to him even if he didn't understand why. One day he decided to try again. He walked inside the center slowly, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The staff was busy talking to parents, and no one noticed him at first. He took one careful step toward the piano, then another. Just as he reached the edge of the piano bench, a staff member turned around. She recognized him instantly. "You're not allowed to play unless you have permission," she said firmly, though not unkindly. He froze. His breath felt heavy. This time, however, he didn't run. He looked up and whispered, "I just want to try, only for a moment." His voice shook, but the words finally came. The staff member sighed lightly, not in frustration but in uncertainty. She glanced around the lobby, unsure how to respond. She had seen him watching for weeks. She knew he wasn't a troublemaker, but she also knew the rules. "Not today," she said softly. He nodded, swallowing his disappointment. He stepped back from the piano and walked outside again. This time, the rejection stung a little more. But even though he felt discouraged, something inside him had changed. He had finally spoken up. He had asked. Over the next few days, he noticed that different staff members looked at him with more awareness. They weren't ignoring him anymore. They saw how much he cared, even if they didn't fully understand it. The volunteer who had been watching him felt a growing curiosity. She had seen kids obsessed with sports or games, but she hadn't seen a kid so devoted to just listening before. She started paying more attention, and each day, her concern grew stronger. One evening, she approached the staff member who had turned him away and asked quietly, "Do we ever let kids who aren't in classes use the piano? Just to try?" The staff member shrugged. "Only if they have someone to guide them. Otherwise, it's against policy." The volunteer nodded but kept thinking about it. She wondered if there might be a way to help him. He didn't know any of these conversations were happening. He simply kept standing by the window, waiting and hoping. He didn't realize it, but the world was slowly noticing him, his dedication, his patience, his quiet love for the music. And even though he had been refused again, something new was building around him. A chance was coming, a real one, and it was closer than he thought. For a long time, the boy had only been a quiet presence around the community center, someone who came to listen and then walked away without disturbing anyone. But things were shifting now, little by little. People were beginning to notice him, not as a problem or someone hanging around aimlessly, but as a child who carried a kind of longing that wasn't easy to ignore. He didn't know that the volunteer who had been watching him had spoken to others about him. He had no idea that the staff had started paying more attention when he came by. All he knew was that something inside him had changed the day he finally asked for permission and was refused. It hurt, but at the same time he felt braver than before. He had found the courage to speak, and even though he hadn't gotten the chance he wanted, he didn't regret trying. The following week, he kept returning to the center at the same time every day. The lobby always looked different depending on who was there. Sometimes filled with little kids running around, sometimes quiet with adults reading on benches, sometimes noisy with teenagers waiting for their turns in the gym. But the piano remained the center of his attention, no matter what else was happening. The volunteer started sitting a little closer to where he usually stood. She didn't want to scare him or make him uncomfortable, but she wanted to understand him better. She noticed the way his eyes moved every time someone played the piano. It wasn't the look of someone who was simply entertained. It was the look of someone who belonged to the music even though he had never been able to touch it. One late afternoon, when the center was less busy, she walked past him and said softly, "You're here again." Her voice was warm, not questioning. He nodded, unsure how to reply. "You like listening, don't you?" she asked. He nodded again. She smiled. "You listen like someone who understands more than the rest of us." He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to adults noticing him like that. Most of them barely glanced his way. That same evening, she stayed near the piano after everyone left. She played a simple, smooth melody as if she were testing something. When she finished, she turned slightly and saw him still standing there. She gave him a gentle nod before leaving. Something in her expression suggested that she wasn't ignoring his dream. Maybe she was trying to figure out how to help. As the days went on, the staff began to treat him differently. Not in a big way, but in small, quiet ways. If he walked inside the lobby, nobody rushed to stop him unless he went too close to the piano. They didn't shoo him away. They didn't glare. They simply watched him, trying to understand what made him come back every day. But the rules were still the rules. No one was allowed to use the piano unless they were part of a class or supervised. And he wasn't part of anything. He was just a kid who loved the sound. One chilly afternoon, he stood by the window as usual. The glass was cold enough to fog a little each time he breathed on it. Inside, a teenager was practicing scales with decent skill. The melody was repetitive but clean. He watched the teen's hands carefully, memorizing how the fingers moved up and down the keys. He started whispering the rhythm, his lips moving in silent patterns as he imagined how the sound would feel under his touch. While he was lost in the moment, the volunteer approached him from inside the lobby. She noticed how focused he was and quietly asked the staff nearby, "Has anyone ever talked to him properly?" "No," one of them answered. "He doesn't say much. He just listens." She thought for a moment and said, "Maybe we should try something different." They didn't act right away, but the thought hung in the air. That evening, the center became unusually quiet. Only a few people remained, and the piano sat empty again. He didn't like staying too long after sunset, but something made him linger that day. He felt as if something was about to happen, though he couldn't explain why. The volunteer stepped closer to the piano and played a short, sweet tune. When she finished, she turned toward the window and gestured lightly for him to come closer. Not into the building, but just closer to her direction. He stepped toward the doorway, unsure of what she wanted. His heart beat quickly, thinking maybe she was going to scold him for staring too much. But her expression wasn't strict. It was curious, almost hopeful. "You've been coming here for a long time," she said gently. He nodded. "Why do you like the piano so much?" she asked softly. He looked down before answering. "It feels like the music talks to me." She didn't laugh or look confused. She simply said, "I believe that." Her calm response gave him the courage to continue. "I want to try it, just once. But I know I'm not allowed." She studied his face for a moment, then said quietly, "Rules exist for reasons, but sometimes exceptions happen when the reason is good enough." His eyes widened. It was the first time an adult had said something that made him feel like a chance wasn't impossible. She didn't let him touch the piano that day. She couldn't. The other staff members were still around, and she didn't want to break any rules in front of them. But that moment planted a seed. Over the next few days, she talked to the staff more seriously. Some were unsure. Some wanted to help. Some simply didn't care, but they didn't argue either. The piano was important to the center, but they all knew the boy wasn't trying to damage it. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't loud. He had been respectful every day for months. One staff member asked, "What if he breaks it?" The volunteer replied, "Kids younger than him have played it. He just wants one chance." Another added, "He doesn't even know how. He'll just make noise." The volunteer shook her head. "I don't think he will." Nobody knew why she believed that, not even her. She just felt something when she watched him. A quiet certainty. One evening, the community center had fewer visitors than usual. The rooms were closing early because of an upcoming holiday event. The lobby was nearly empty. Only one staff member stood behind the front desk, sorting papers. The volunteer saw him standing outside, as he always did. The fading sunlight made his silhouette look even smaller than usual. She hesitated for a moment, then walked to the desk and whispered something to the staff member. The staff member looked uncertain, glanced at the boy, then nodded slowly. She opened the front door and stepped outside. He looked up at her, surprised. She smiled slightly. "Come inside for a moment." His heart jumped. "Inside?" he whispered. She nodded. "Just for a moment. Don't worry." He followed her carefully, afraid that if he moved too fast, the moment would vanish. When he stepped inside the lobby, the warm air wrapped around him, but he barely noticed. His eyes went straight to the piano. It looked the same as always, beautiful and intimidating. But tonight, something about it felt different, felt closer. The volunteer walked ahead and gently pulled the piano bench out. She glanced back at him and said softly, "You can sit, only sit. Not touch yet." He nodded quickly, grateful even for that. He approached the bench slowly and lowered himself onto it. For the first time, he could see the piano up close. The wood had tiny scratches from years of use. The keys were slightly worn near the edges. The faint smell of polished wood drifted up. His heart raced. He had never been this close to it before. The volunteer watched him quietly. She could see that he was not simply excited, he was overwhelmed. After a minute, she said, "You've been so patient. More patient than many adults would be." He looked at her nervously, unsure if she was preparing to take the moment away. But instead of stepping back, she gently placed a hand near the keys. "Would you like to try just one note?" she asked softly. His breath caught in his throat. He nodded. Not a quick, excited nod, but a slow, trembling one, like someone saying yes to something precious. She lowered her hand and pointed to one of the keys. "Just this one. Press it gently." He lifted his shaking hand and moved it slowly toward the piano, the instrument he had spent months only dreaming of. And for the first time, he touched a key. The sound that rang out was soft, simple, and pure. But to him, it felt like the world had finally opened a door. The morning after the award ceremony, the hall felt strangely quiet. The seats were empty now, the bright lights dimmed, and the echoes of applause no longer bounced off the walls. Yet the memory of that moment, the one where the crowd stood up for him, where his music filled the room and left people wiping their eyes, still seemed to float in the air like something alive. He walked inside slowly, almost shyly, with the same hesitant steps he used the very first day he had come here. Back then, he had barely been allowed to touch the piano. Now the workers at the hall smiled at him, nodded at him, and held doors open for him like he was someone who mattered. He didn't know how to react to that kind of attention, so he simply kept his head low and moved quietly toward the stage. The old piano sat there waiting, its surface polished, its keys shining softly even in the weaker morning light. Anyone else might have walked straight up with confidence. But he paused at the first step of the stage, like he was reminding himself this wasn't a dream, and no one was about to push him away this time. When he finally placed his hands on the keys, he didn't start playing right away. Instead, he let his fingers rest there gently, almost like he was greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The coolness of the keys felt familiar, grounding. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply, letting the silence settle into his chest. He wasn't here to impress anyone today. He wasn't here to perform or to prove himself, or to show the judges that they had been wrong to doubt him. He was here simply to play, to let out everything he had been holding in since that night. The first few notes were soft. They drifted through the empty hall like a whisper, delicate enough that they almost disappeared before reaching the back row. But then he added another note, and soon the sound grew into something warmer, something that wrapped around the empty seats and filled the space with quiet emotion. He played without rushing, letting the melody guide him. Sometimes his fingers moved slowly, barely brushing the keys. Other times they moved with a kind of urgency, as though they were chasing the next sound before it had time to fade. Every part of him was focused, his hands, his breathing, even the way he leaned into the instrument as if the piano and he were sharing a secret no one else could hear. He didn't know how long he played. Could have been minutes or maybe an hour. Time felt different when his hands were on the keys. When he finally paused, he kept his fingers on the last chord until it dissolved completely into silence. The moment it faded, he opened his eyes and lifted his hands, letting out a slow exhale. That was when he noticed someone sitting in one of the seats. Not right in front, not too close, but somewhere near the back. At first, he thought it might be a worker taking a break. But when the figure stood up and walked forward, he recognized the walk, the posture, the way the person held themselves as if balancing a lot of thoughts at once. It was the hall manager, the same person who had once told him firmly that he wasn't allowed to touch the piano. Not even for a minute, not even to try. Back then, the manager had seemed strict, distant, almost cold. But today, the expression on the manager's face looked different. Softer. The manager approached but stopped a few steps away, giving him space, as if not wanting to interrupt whatever moment he was still in. For a long second, they didn't say anything. Then, in a voice quieter than he had ever heard from them, the manager said, You play like the piano belongs to you." He didn't know what to say to that. His hands tightened nervously in front of him. Compliments still felt strange, like clothes that didn't quite fit yet. The manager continued, "You know, when you first asked to touch the piano, I thought you were just another young person who wanted to play around with it. We get many who don't understand what it means to respect an instrument. I didn't know you were." They paused, searching for the right word. "I didn't know you were someone who carried music in your hands." He looked down, unsure how to respond, unsure if he should smile or stay serious. "I'm sorry," the manager added gently, "for refusing you that day, for not seeing what you had inside you." Hearing that made something twist in his chest. He wasn't angry about the past. He never had been. But knowing the person who once denied him now stood here apologizing, that meant more than he could say. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I understand." The manager nodded, and in their expression there was something like relief. "If you ever want to practice here," they said, "the hall will always have a place for you. Any day, any time." He nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude he didn't know how to voice. The manager gave him one last warm look, then stepped back to let him return to the piano. But he didn't sit right away. Instead, he took a slow breath and looked out over the rows of seats. For the first time, he imagined them filled with people not judging him, not waiting for him to fail, not wondering whether he belonged on that stage, but simply listening, believing in him. He placed his hands on the keys again, and this time when he started playing, the notes felt lighter, freer, as if the music was no longer weighed down by fear or doubt. While he played, someone quietly entered the hall and stood near the door. It was the elderly teacher from the small workshop who had first heard him play weeks ago. The teacher watched him from a distance with a proud smile that reached their eyes. They didn't call out to him or interrupt. They just listened, letting the music wash over the room. When he finished, he looked up and saw the teacher raising a gentle hand in greeting. He returned the gesture with a shy smile. The teacher walked toward him, their steps slow but steady. "Your playing has changed," the teacher said softly. "It's deeper now, more open." He shrugged a little, unsure how to respond. I've been trying to understand my feelings better," he said honestly. "Sometimes the music just comes from that." The teacher nodded knowingly. Music always reveals what words can't. They sat together on the edge of the stage. The hall was still empty, but sitting there with someone who understood him made it feel less lonely. "Do you know what comes next?" the teacher asked. "After all this attention, after the competition, after the applause?" He shook his head. "I'm not sure. What comes next," the teacher said gently, "is choosing what you want to do with your gift. You've shown the world you have something rare. Now you get to decide where to take it." He thought about that, really thought about it. For so long, all he wanted was one chance to touch the piano, one chance to show he wasn't just dreaming. Now he had more than one chance. He had doors opening in front of him, and people willing to help him step through them. "I'll keep playing," he said softly, "but I don't want to lose the feeling that made me start." The teacher smiled. "As long as you remember why you play, you never will." They left the hall together, walking into the bright sunlight outside. He looked back once more at the building, not with the fear he had felt the first day, but with a quiet sense of belonging. He didn't know what the future would look like yet, but he knew one thing for certain. His journey with music was only beginning, and somewhere deep in his heart, the same feeling he had when he touched the piano for the first time still burned. That small spark of wonder that told him he was meant to create something beautiful, something real, something that reached people even if only for a moment. He carried that feeling with him as he stepped forward, ready for whatever came next. The weeks after the competition felt different, almost like the world had shifted slightly under his feet. Life didn't suddenly become easy, but it felt lighter in ways he had never expected. People he had never met recognized him in small places, at the market, on the street, near the bus stop. Some whispered his name softly. Others simply smiled at him with a warmth he wasn't sure he deserved. He wasn't used to attention, and in truth, he didn't know what to do with it. But he stayed calm, always humble, always quiet, because he knew that nothing mattered more than staying true to himself. The music school sent an official letter to his home, inviting him to join their advanced program. The letter didn't look fancy, but when he held it in his hands, his heart felt so full he had to sit down. For years, he had wondered if he would ever be part of a place like that. A place where people breathed music every day, where practice rooms were filled with melodies, where no one questioned why he loved the piano so deeply. Now they were asking him to come. They wanted him, but taking that step wasn't so simple. Tuition was high, and even though the school offered him a special discount, the numbers still made his chest tighten. The teacher from the workshop visited his house the next day and sat with him and his family at the small wooden table. His mother listened carefully, her eyes filled with pride but also worry. They didn't have much. Every decision they made had to be practical. "We will find a way," the teacher said gently. "There are people who want to support his journey. There are programs, scholarships, sponsors." His mother looked down at her hands. She wanted the best for him, he knew that, but she was scared of making promises they couldn't keep. Later that night, he sat alone in the small courtyard behind their home. The sky was dark, and the air carried a soft chill. He looked up at the stars and closed his eyes. Inside his chest, something pulled at him, a familiar mix of fear and longing. He wanted to learn. He wanted to grow. He wanted to play the piano every day, not just when he was lucky enough to find time or a place. The next day, the teacher returned with news. One of the judges from the competition had contacted them. The judge had been deeply moved by his performance, so moved, in fact, that they wanted to sponsor his first year of studies. When he heard this, he didn't know what to say. His breath caught. His throat tightened. It felt unreal that someone who had only heard him play once would choose to help him in such a big way. His mother's eyes filled with tears. The teacher placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He earned this," the teacher said softly. And so, that was how he found himself stepping through the doors of the music school a month later. The building felt huge, with long hallways and rooms filled with the sound of scales, warm-ups, and soft humming from students preparing for classes. He clutched his small backpack tightly, feeling both excited and shy. He wasn't used to being surrounded by so many people who shared the same passion. His first class was overwhelming. Students played pieces he had only heard online, pieces that sounded impossible to him just months ago. But he watched their hands carefully, absorbing every movement, every shift, every small detail. He practiced twice as hard, stayed longer in the practice rooms, and spent his evenings going over every melody until the school staff gently reminded him to take breaks. Even with all the excitement, he often found himself revisiting the hall where everything started. The hall manager welcomed him every time, no longer strict, no longer distant, but warm and encouraging. Sometimes, when the hall was empty, he would sit at the same piano and just let his hands move with no pressure, no audience, no expectations. Those moments kept him grounded. One afternoon, while he was practicing alone in a quiet room, the teacher from the workshop stopped by. They watched him through the glass window first, smiling at how much he had grown. When he finished playing, the teacher stepped inside. "You're becoming more confident," the teacher said. He nodded shyly. "I'm learning a lot here. What do you want to do with all this?" the teacher asked. "What's your dream now?" He had been thinking about that a lot. The competition, the school, the attention, it had all opened so many paths. But in his heart, the answer felt simple. "I want to help others feel what I felt," he said softly. "When I touch the piano, it feels like the world becomes calmer. I want others to feel that too, even if it's just for a moment." The teacher smiled, touched by his sincerity. "Then you're already on the right path." Months passed. His skill grew, his confidence grew, and his understanding of music deepened in ways he never imagined possible. But through it all, he remained humble, always remembering where he started and the people who helped him along the way. One day, the school held a small gathering, a concert by students to celebrate the end of the season. The hall was full of families, teachers, and guests. He was scheduled to perform last. At first, he felt nervous, so nervous that his hands trembled slightly. But when he stepped onto the stage and sat at the piano, he felt that familiar calm wash over him. The audience quieted. He placed his fingers gently on the keys. And then he played. Not to impress. Not to prove anything. Not to win. But to speak. The melody that flowed from the piano was warm and full of life. It carried pieces of his journey. The first time he touched the piano, the moment he was refused, the day he was invited to play, the night of the competition, the lessons at school, the practice rooms, the doubts, the hope. All of it lived inside the music. People in the audience leaned forward. Some closed their eyes. Others sat completely still, afraid to miss even a single note. When the last sound faded into silence, there was a moment where the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Then came the applause. It wasn't loud or wild this time. It was soft, deep, filled with respect. The teacher from the workshop clapped with a proud smile. The hall manager wiped away a tear discreetly. His mother sat in the front row with her hands pressed together, overcome with emotion. He bowed gently, then stepped away from the piano, feeling something new, a quiet certainty. On his way out of the hall, a young child approached him shyly, holding onto a small notebook. "How do you play like that?" the child asked softly. He smiled, kneeling slightly to meet the child's eyes. "I just play what I feel," he said. "And I practice a lot." The child smiled back, encouraged. As he walked out into the evening air, the sky glowing softly with the colors of sunset, he felt a gentle sense of peace. His journey wasn't over, it was only beginning. There would be harder days, mistakes, long hours, challenges he wasn't ready for yet. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had learned something important. The world didn't always make room for you at first. Sometimes it shut you out. Sometimes it doubted you. But if you kept going, if you held on to the spark inside you, if you let your heart guide your hands, you could carve out a space that was yours. A space where your voice mattered. A space where your music could live. He walked forward with quiet steps, the sound of the piano still echoing softly in his mind, ready to continue writing his story one note at a time.